Hi everybody! Welcome back to sewing my Japanese duffel coat. It's been a minute. Obviously I have different hair. A lot of time, I think like 2 weeks has passed. And then as always, I spent a lot of time just overthinking everything. So I bought some new lining material. This is Robert Kaufman flannel, and this I will use for my lining. So I have to recut out all my lining pieces. I think the next thing I need to do is actually attach the sleeves, which I've been just a little bit nervous about because that can go poorly, but I'm gonna do that next. Before pinning my sleeve into place, I just did a row of basting stitches so that I could gather that sleeve head and ease it into place. One extra step I really like to do is baste my sleeves in place. That way when I'm actually attaching the sleeve with the sewing machine, I don't have any pins in my way, and it's a lot easier to make sure that I'm not creating any puckers or accidentally poke myself with a pin like I have done many times while trying to attach a sleeve. So we have sleeves. It almost makes it feel like it's actually a coat, actually, for the first time. So to make my own sleeve heads, I am just cutting some bias cut strips. I'm just using some warm and natural quilt batting, and I am cutting strips that are 2 inches wide by at least 8 inches long. I'm going to trim them down to size later. Then I just pin those strips to the seam allowance of my sleeve heads, and the length of the strip is facing towards the sleeve. After pinning those in place, I just stitch them about 1/16 of an inch away from where I already stitched on my sleeve, so it's just within the seam allowance. Now I'm just attaching my shoulder pads to my shoulders. And when you do this, you just attach it in a few places so it doesn't pull on your coat. Time to pin and stitch this hood together. Then I just trim down one side of the seam allowance on that hood and press the other side over and top stitch it in place. Now to pin that hood in place and then stitch it on, then I will press the seam allowances open, clipping some of the seam allowances where I need to on the coat side. Now, welt pocket time. I am not even going to go over every step in this process, or this video would end up being super long, but I will link to some resources for how to sew a welt pocket in the description below. Now before I sew all of my lining pieces together, I am going to attach the facings. And make sure you align your notches because the front facings should extend a little bit longer than the lining itself.
Then when I stitch this in place along the front facing, I make sure to stop stitching once I get to that bottom notch. Everything below that notch should be left unstitched for now.
Oh my god, I'm filming during daylight hours for once. In my defense, the sun does set at like 4:30, so I attached this very cute little label. Time for a pretend it's done. I really love the flannel lining. I'm so happy that I decided to use that. I am going to use the rayon for the arms so that they're slippery. One thing that was a little bit different about the construction for the lining, the seam allowance here is 1.2 centimeters, so like half an inch roughly. Even though it's sewn at half an inch, then I press it towards the back at 5/8 of an inch. So I'm just now realizing that I'm pretty sure I was supposed to stitch the shoulder seam at 1.5 centimeters, not 1.2 like I did with the side seams. So I'm gonna go redo that. That part of the translation I was really not sure about, and just looking at it again, I'm pretty sure I got it wrong. So I am gonna go sew these again. Just to make it clear what I'm working with in terms of Google Translate, I'm just gonna read to you that instruction that I found really confusing. So this is how Google translated it. Okay. The shoulder line of the back body of 1 and the shoulder line of the back front body of 2 are inside. The side line is sewn 1.2 meters from the edge of the cloth. That's not right. The shoulder seam allowance is in return. Only the part of the sword. Divide by the rest. Seam allowance with an iron. Defeat it behind. So really, without the diagrams, I would be pretty lost. So it looks like you do a similar thing with this sleeve as with the side seams of the lining. So I stitched it at 1.2 centimeters and I am going to press it to the back at 1.5 centimeters.
The way I'm attaching the sleeves to the lining is pretty similar to how I did it with the exterior of the coat, except that the sleeve head doesn't need to be gathered as much. There is just a lot less fabric there, so you don't need to ease it in as much.
Alright, so there's the lining of the body done. I just have to do the lining for the hood. And you can kind of see here where I've trimmed down in the underarm area to give it a little bit more movement. And I just came back in and zigzag stitched over the seam allowance here because it's a little too hard to get it under my serger when it's so short.
That hood lining is constructed in a pretty similar way as to the rest of the lining pieces. So you stitch it at 1.2 centimeters, then fold it over at 1.5. Then I can sew the facing to the hood lining and then attach that hood right onto my coat lining. Well, it really felt like this point would never come, but finally I get to pin that coat lining to the exterior of the coat and stitch it together.
Okay, so I am now top stitching around the whole coat, which I am a little bit nervous about just because I have a feeling I'm not gonna be able to do it in one try and I'm gonna have to redo it, which is a real pain in the butt. So wish me luck.
So I'm just adding some chain stitches in a few places like the shoulders and the underarms to attach the lining loosely to the exterior of the coat. And then I'm going to go ahead and attach the lining and the coat at the cuffs. And honestly, pinning these cuffs together was so confusing. I was only like 40% sure it wasn't going to come out completely twisted or something. I'm not even sure I understand this well enough to give you any advice about it, aside from just try to make sure that the back of the sleeve is pinned to the back of the sleeve lining, and same for the fronts, and of course you want them to be right sides together. Now it's finally time to sew the hem, and I am just pinning this in place, and I'm gonna leave an area about 10 centimeters-ish unstitched so that I can use that to turn the whole coat right side out. So before I turned this whole coat out, I did catch stitch using a herringbone stitch the seam allowance of the hem lining to the exterior of the coat. That should just keep the line of the hem in place. And of course, I'll need to come into these corners and slip stitch them closed, as well as slip stitching that hole in the lining closed. Before I did that, I did add a couple more chain stitches attaching the side seams of the coat and lining.
Let me just update you on a few things I did off camera. So I tried to do a hand-stitched buttonhole. Let me just show you this atrocity that I attempted. It is one of the ugliest things I've ever created.
It looks like it was made by a 2-year-old monkey on a farm.
So I did a little test, one just using my buttonhole, automatic buttonhole on my sewing machine, which is that one right there below, and it turned out okay, aside from the fact that I broke my buttonhole foot sewing it because this was so thick that a piece of the feed dogs on the foot just broke off. So I ended up just super gluing it back on and continuing to sew the last couple of buttons. But that was not great.
So close to being done now. All we need to do is attach these straps and toggles, and I'm just taping them in place, and I'm going to stitch right on top of the tape. To attach the leather straps, I used a leather needle and some heavy-duty thread. I don't backstitch at all, I just take all the top threads to the back and tie everything off on the back side. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the toggles on the other side of the coat, and just a few more stitches and this coat is done.
It's done! It's done! So here it is all buttoned up. I've got the buttons on the sleeve tabs here. Here is what it looks like on the inside. I've got my inner pockets. Overall, I am super happy with it. It is really nice to have this nice winter coat here in Southern California where it is currently 70 degrees. Guys, I make poor choices sometimes. Time for the coat dance. All right, it's been cool.